Good morning, everybody. My name is Elen Krut, and today is July 5th of 2021. We are continuing to conduct the interviews for the New York State lawyers' response to the pandemic project as part of the Historical Society for New York Courts. And today we're sitting here with Timothy O'Donovan. And Tim, your last interview was on June 21st of 2020, so a year and a few days ago. And I just want to first find out, how are you? How have you been, and how is your experience with the opening in general?
Well, good morning, Ellen. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's very nice to be here, and thank you for interviewing me. I appreciate that
Absolutely.
very much. It has been, a transition. It's been at times difficult, but at times it's been more of the same as it was before. And we have developed and adapted, and we have become, as solo practitioners, and I speak primarily from that experience, as somebody who has sort of adapted to the technology while trying to also come back to the fact that we are getting back to where we were before and deciding what to keep from the pandemic and what to go back to.
Great. And as a solo practitioner, what was your experience like with reopening? Because last time we met, we were talking about, that initial stage of being wowed by the shutdowns, and like we have to adapt to the technology, and how do we go to court? How do we do anything law related? Now it has been a year, and I think that the central theme of everybody's interview is adaptation. How did you adapt, and what did you do?
Well, I learned how to do a lot of remote work. I learned also how to interact with my clients in a different way.
And what is that way?
Well, we used a lot of Zoom, a lot of Microsoft Teams with our clients in order to not only talk to them about their case, but also to find out how they were doing, and actually to retain clients through the process of Zoom initially. As you might expect, the numbers were down in terms of cases. I do primarily personal injury plaintiffs work, and obviously with the shutdown, there weren't as many people out of the roadway, there weren't as many people walking, so there are just less situations where people would come into needing my type of services. And so the ones that did, we had to deal with remotely, and had to learn how to communicate with them outside of them coming to our office. So that presented a bit of a challenge, but we learned, and we certainly adapted, and it's going to become something that's part of our practice going forward. Even with the cases that were in lawsuit, we had depositions that were done remotely, and that's something that we have kind of learned to do. Sometimes it has its advantages, sometimes it doesn't. But I think it's here to stay, at least in some hybrid form, and it is helpful in moving cases along. So I think the biggest thing that I learned is that not to be afraid of the technology, but not to completely embrace it either. Because the human touch is needed, and you need to be in front of people and be near people. We're social beings, and you don't get all of that from the remote. So the remote is helpful, but it can't replace.
And I agree with you completely. And I specifically remember last time we spoke, you discussed two things, because we were not sure what's going to happen. We had no idea what the future holds. And your discussion, and maybe you can call it a prediction in some ways, you said that we have to worry about two different impacts. One was the immediate impact, and one is the long-term impact. And can you talk about that? Do you think that your predictions came true? What are those impacts, and are you seeing that right now?
Well, I think the immediate impact was that we would have people leave this area, and that is certainly has happened, and that's turned into a long-term impact. Some clients that we may have had They've referred us cases. They are moving to Florida, South Carolina. They're not staying here. And a lot of that has happened because of the ability to work remotely, or people retiring earlier. So you're seeing, like, for solo practitioners such as myself, some of our client base is leaving the area, and that certainly has an impact. The impact initially of the business, as I just referred to earlier, less accidents because less people are on the road and less people are out in the world, will affect us going forward, because our inventory of cases is down, will be down for the next year or so, and that does have an impact. So I think that the immediate impact of there being less work is definitely going to continue within the next year or so, but the long-term impact will be there, because you'll have a client base that has left, and you have to replace that client base. But also you have an issue of how you get cases as a solo practitioner. Part of the way we get cases, we see people in court, and another attorney might say, "Hey, I have something for you," or you see somebody out there, "I like your argument in court, I want to hire you." That's not going to be there for the foreseeable future as we continue to do remote conferences, remote motions, things of that nature. So I think that there is an immediate and long-term impact of the remote situation that solo practitioners will have to work around.
And did you have an opportunity for an in-person court appearance yet?
Well, no, I have not. I've done a couple of in-person depositions in New Jersey. I practice in New Jersey as well. So New York has been strictly, Microsoft Teams, some by phone, and it's a challenge, because the part of what we do when we have the courts go into court, I think there's more of an effort, not by the court, but by the parties, to do what they're supposed to do. When you're in a situation where you're kind of like, okay, we should do this, we should do that, some things get lost through the cracks, and that's unfortunate, but it does happen. It's human nature, and so we have to rein in a lot of that and kind of get used to the idea that we're kind of on the honor system with a lot of this stuff, but that's the only way that ultimately we can continue to operate and survive.
And when you had to go to New Jersey and do those in-person depositions, how did it feel? Did it feel weird?
It felt a little strange, because I had to get my temperature taken, and my temperature was like 96, and I'm like, is there something wrong with the machine? So that was kind of, so that was odd, but it was a deposition that had to be done in person, because it's a client that was kind of had some issues that it would have been difficult to do remotely with. So it did. Once we got into the deposition, we were all far away from each other. It was a big law firm, so they had a big conference area, so nobody was close to each other. So it felt the same once it started, but the beginnings of it was a little strange, because driving down there, was in the southern part of New Jersey. It took me about half the time that it would normally take, because nobody was on the road. So it's a little eerie in that respect. But once it started, it was as if it had always been before the pandemic.
Well, I also need to know that you have a lot of experience conducting depositions. What do you think it would be like for somebody who has not been admitted for as long as you have been admitted, or hasn't that much experience? Do you think that in addition to having that concern, hey, do I have everything here, my questions, my exhibits, getting there on time, so we have to deal with so much, and then when we get there, we also have to worry about the temperature, and do you think that takes away from the lawyer's ability to perform well?
I think it becomes a little harder to read people because you're not really seeing their complete self. You're not seeing if they're fidgeting. You're not seeing if they're nervous when you're asking them questions. So it's definitely a disadvantage to some extent. But as you get more experience, you could at least do a credible deposition. It won't be, I don't believe, a great deposition because you can't be in front of the person and really read them the way you could. So I think that there are disadvantages to it, but given what's going on in terms of trying to move cases, that outweighs any disadvantages right now.
And I think what you just said is referring to the virtual deposition.
Yes.
So I just want to go back to the in-person one. When you got there, right? So driving there was a breeze, and you're concentrating on what you have to do, looking at your documents, you fill some particulars, but then all of a sudden you have to go through extra steps and make sure that your temperature is taken and you have a mask on, and like we have to be sitting 6 feet apart. Do you
Right.
think that takes away from the ability to conduct an interview? And I apologize, not the interview, deposition.
Yeah, it can if you let it. You have to sort of just take it. You got to pretend you don't have a mask on. You really do. You have to just be like it's as if you're in front of the person, like you and I are speaking now. That's the only way you can do it. If you start worrying about being self-conscious about the mask on, it's going to keep you from concentrating about what the task is at hand, taking this person's deposition. So it can distract you, but you can't let it. Sometimes you can use that to your advantage too, with a witness. If you have a witness that you want to rattle a little bit, sometimes having this type of having the mask on, something like that could unnerve them also. So you have to try to use a disadvantage and make it into an advantage.
That's smart. And my understanding is that experience plays a huge role in this because you naturally feel more comfortable and confident in your abilities to conduct this deposition. And I guess attorneys who haven't been admitted this long, they don't have the same advantage, I would say. It's the same as going to court versus doing a virtual court appearance. When you're in court, personally, I am an observer. I observe, and this is how I learn. So in court, besides the fact that I'm getting my experience doing a particular appearance, I'm also observing others, and I'm hearing different phrases, legal language that I can adapt and use in the future. Let's say a phrase sounds fantastic, and I will use it in the future. So, and the way more seasoned attorneys conduct themselves and what happens on different cases. So we don't have that opportunity anymore. So do you think that the newly admitted attorneys are at a disadvantage at this point?
Yeah, yes, they are. But they have one big advantage, and that's the technology that they're more used to than the older lawyers. Like I've seen lawyers around my age, even older, that get very frustrated with the technology, and it keeps them from doing as good a deposition as they might have done in person. So the younger lawyers who are more used to that are more likely to be patient with it, more likely to understand how to move around exhibits and sharing files and stuff like that. So they have an advantage when it comes to kind of being used to the technology like that. And it's because some of the older guys, they don't want to do it, or it's just something that they're not used to. And so that gives the younger attorneys one advantage, but it does hurt them, and it hurts them in general with remote work, that they can't go down the hall and speak to an experienced lawyer about what happened on a particular case. Should we have done it this way? Should I have said this? Should I have argued that? You don't have that much with remote work, and that's true not only with depositions, but with anything, advice, how to work on a particular file, and that's something that is a disadvantage for young attorneys, not having to be able to speak to people that are experienced in person. You're much more likely, I think, to do that than remotely.
I do agree with you, and I think last time we met, we were discussing adaptation to technology. I feel like you looked in the crystal ball and you were saying we have to adapt to technology. This was one of your advices moving forward. So now that it has been a year and we have been adapting to technology, we had no choice. Do you have any other advices, given the fact that we have lived through the whole year of adapting and transitioning and waiting? So do you have any advice?
Well, I think there's certain things we have to decide whether we're going to keep now that we've started. Some of the things, you open up the genie bottle, you can't put it back in. I think remote notarizations is something that should be here to stay. I think that is something that, they just, the executive order just stopped that.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's a bill, I believe, that's been brought by the legislature that has passed, and the governor hasn't signed it yet. The remote notarizations has made a lot easier for attorneys and their clients to deal with each other. The convenience of it is immeasurable, and that's something I think that only came to us because of this issue, this pandemic, this crisis, but it's something that we should keep. There's other things that maybe we shouldn't keep, and I think that we have to decide how much of the remoteness that we want. For instance, in New Jersey, they started to do remote jury trials, and they had ordered that. I didn't have one. I almost had one, but I didn't have one, and I took some CLEs for that and went through it. And ultimately, I think most of the times it's a disservice to the client to do a remote trial. You just cannot really watch what the jurors are doing. The jurors are in situations where it gets too tempting to be distracted. So I think that remote trials is not a good idea. And I don't think that we should have remote trials. Remote depositions we should keep, but it should be some type of hybrid form. And if there's certain situations where we absolutely have to have an in-person deposition, you should be able to have that. There are situations where you have an out-of-state witness, understandable remote depositions. Obviously, with, I believe, non-party witnesses who hate coming in for depositions, and the rate must be 50-50 whether they come in or not, maybe even less. So having these remote depositions more at the ready allows for non-party witnesses to have their depositions taken more freely, more completely. So I think that's a good thing. So those are just examples. I think there are certain things we should just not do, certain things we should do some of the time, and certain things we should do all of the time. I think that that's the lesson coming from this.
And I would imagine that people save a lot of money when they don't have to bring somebody from out of state and they can just conduct, a virtual deposition. But otherwise, you cannot ensure the quality of that deposition because you cannot control the technology. You cannot control the Wi-Fi strength and, the signal. The signal might go this way, but you need it to go this way. And you also cannot control the person. You can only explain things so much because we have seen those videos of the depositions go bad.
Right.
And virtual appearances go bad. And
Yes.
I feel like conducting virtual anything have, in a way, lowered the standards because you see people not wearing, professional clothes. You see people not finding a professional space or at least a suitable space. So I would agree with you. So if we have somebody doing a deposition out of state, I feel like the least they can do is to comply with some sort of requirement to have a professional background, professional appearances. And, maybe there should be centers for that. Maybe a virtual deposition center, where people can go and turn to, because not everybody has access to a better Wi-Fi or a professional, like appearance or, I don't know, like even the space, But at the same time, we don't want people to lay in bed and finish the deposition on the couch.
Right.
So, yeah, I completely agree with you. So, it's a well-known fact that an attorney must be competent, okay, in order to represent the client. And when you were talking about your jury trial, you said to me that well, there was some concern about, exhibits, and you have to present your case, and it might not be fair to your client. So do you think that being able to navigate technology is now a part of the competency that the attorney has to possess in order to competently represent the client? Is that like a new concept? Was that added, to the code of the professional responsibility?
Well, that's a great question, and I think yes. I mean, if you have a case where you have a client, let's say it's a 35-year-old woman who fractures her ankle, shatters it, has surgery, and walks with a limp. If you're doing a jury trial virtually, the jury's not going to see that. They're going to see somebody on a screen talking. They're not going to see your client getting off the stand once she's testified, walking with a limp. So that's something that you have to really push hard, say, judge, this is not appropriate for a virtual trial. Now, you might have a situation where, let's say you've got an individual who's does not make a great witness. Maybe there's something about this witness where, we're not, let's say they have a back issue, but yet they're a big weightlifter, and they look like, someone might look at them and say, they don't look like they're really hurt. Whereas if you look at them on a screen, you're only seeing them neck up. Maybe in that situation, a virtual jury trial won't be so bad because they won't see the other parts to question whether he's really or she's really hurt. So that's certainly part of the strategy that now goes into this that you have to look at. But the competency, no question about it, you have to understand, just like understanding if you get your system gets hacked and your client's personal information is taken, you have to you have responsibility with that as well. So the technology will create more obligations, professional obligations of attorneys going forward, how they interact with their clients, what they say on, if you say something on a virtual that you shouldn't be saying. And those are things now that people never really thought about before. You have to really be careful. You have to be very professional. You have to dress appropriately, and you have to make sure that you're understanding the technology. There are situations where if you don't have the button on to stop the sound, you might be unwittingly affecting attorney-client privilege, where somebody can hear what's being said between you and your client. That's something that you have to be very, very careful about. So that's one of the things I mean about hearing things, that what you say. If you're talking to your client frankly about something and the button is not pushed to keep the audio, you might be violating attorney-client privilege. So you got to be real careful.
Do you think that us needing the technology, so I think before you said that you see this in the future, we're still going to be using technology in the future. So in order to make sure that we are all competent, because I think that most of the new attorneys know how to navigate Zoom and Teams and be technologically savvy, I feel like they still need to be taught. So do you believe that this is something that we need to invest in right now, starting from law schools? Because in law schools, well, in order to be an attorney, you have to be able to write. So we had legal writing courses.
Right.
Do you think that these courses should incorporate Zoom and Teams meeting? Because being technologically savvy also means that you have to present your exhibits, right? You have to be able to get it done.
Right.
Not just know how to get it done. So if you're unable to navigate your exhibits, you're failing your client essentially. So this is something that you need to do. So do you believe that the legal professionals as a whole should start investing in this technological education and start teaching students how to navigate it, and maybe provide those COEs to attorneys?
Well, yeah, and we're already starting to do that. You're starting to see how to conduct a virtual deposition, how to do a virtual jury trial. It's not only just about exhibits, it's also about how you advocate, how you orally argue on Zoom as opposed to in person. There's a different art to it. There's a different pace to it. You cannot be sitting there. At least I don't think you can't be one of these attorneys who might in court get histrionic and pound the table and all that. You cannot do that on Zoom. It's got to be a different way. It doesn't come off right. So you have to be able to get your point across, be forceful in a way, but in a way that makes sense while you're talking. You got to think of it almost like you're on television. And if you look on television, people who lose their temper and start to jump up and down and all that, if they're in a kind of a news setting, it doesn't come off very well. So the most persuasive, as far as I could see, are people that can be forceful with their words, but they're also, cognizant that they're on a camera. And I think that that's a different skill, and yeah, that has to be taught, not only to law students, but lawyers that are now adapting and changing.
And if we start teaching that in law school, my prediction is that it's here to stay, because now you're investing in it.
Yeah.
And now it's just going to become a part of the legal practice.
Yeah. No, it certainly will. It's going to be some form of hybrid. It's just a question of how much technology replaces. It can replace some of it, but it cannot replace all of it. You still need to have in person. No one's going to want to have a murder trial done by Zoom. I mean, it's just not something that I think can work for serious medical malpractice case by Zoom. I just don't see that working. But you might see basic auto cases done by Zoom for trials. I'm against those as it is, but I can see them doing it because they consider them, simpler cases.
And let's say we do proceed in this hybrid model, and we will conduct some of the cases on virtually, let's say small BC conferences that nobody wants to get to and spend 6 minutes there, and other things more substantial like motion arguing or a deposition or a trial we'll do in person. So if we proceed with a model like that, do you think that there should be a universal standard for all courts in New York, or do you think there should be a discretion and it should be up to a judge how that judge wants to conduct, business in his courtroom?
I think there has to be discretion. I think there's probably differences like in upstate New York, certain counties where it's more sparse and people are spread out further. The Zoom model works better. And more necessary than downstate where we are. So it's going to depend upon each particular county's needs. It's also going to depend upon, an individual case too. So I think that it's hard to put these things in uniform rules. There could be aspirations and goals, but not necessarily directives, because it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
I agree with you, because I was thinking about how that, hybrid model would be implemented if we have a hybrid model. Would it be that this particular judge on Tuesday, he only does virtual conferences, on Wednesday we have in-person motion arguing, on Thursdays we have trials, Fridays we have virtual conferences again. So that's something definitely to, think about and put together, because essentially we're talking about efficiency. How can we move the cases along? Because we are trying to do our best job for the client, And so I guess the last thing that I wanted to ask you is that crystal ball you have.
Yeah.
And you were able to foreshadow the technology aspect of it, that we will still have it, we will rely on it. Now, a year later, it's in full progress. What are your predictions if we get a chance to sit down again a year from now, because we're still in the middle of this project? what do you think is going to happen? What do you think we will talk about a year from now?
Well, I think there's still going to be the struggle between what's going to be permanently remote and what's going to be in person. I think you'll still see a lot of stuff remote, and we'll have to see how that works. I know it's a few of the court parts or some of the busier parts are backed up in different counties, and so in person would really help, especially trials. One of the things we have to see is how jurors react to coming back to being in this process again. If jurors are more reluctant, jurors might say, well, why can't we do this remotely? Why can't I do this from my home? I heard that some places do that, so why do I have to come here and spend all this time? So some of the attitudes of people outside the court system may dictate how this works. Funding, other, potential jurors, politicians, all people outside the system are going to have a say as to how this system runs, which is the way it should be.
And does that include the client?
Well, the client will have some say, yeah, absolutely, how you dictate your case. I mean, you might have a client say, look, I want you to kind of slow walk the case because I want this to get out of the pandemic time where I know that jurors are not going to be wearing masks, and there's not going to be this situation where they're worried about getting sick as opposed to worried about hearing my case. There might be some clients that may think that way. Most clients want their cases resolved as soon as possible, but there may be some clients that think that way. But I think that there's going to be, we're here next year talking about this, there's going to be that still that tension between, taking stuff from the pandemic and making it permanent and getting back to quote unquote normal. There'll still be that tension. It won't be resolved, I don't think, by next year.
You think it's going to take longer?
I think it's going to take longer because, first of all, we don't know whether they're going to have another variant or of some sort. If that happens, that'll upset the apple cart. But also, I think we're still trying to figure out, what worked and what didn't work during this time.
Definitely. And I feel like, in many ways, having this pandemic was a wake-up call. Just to see that, hey, there are many different ways that we can approach, doing depositions or in-person appearances or practice the law in general, starting from speaking with the client, opposing counsel. So I feel like now we are presented with options that we can either adopt and create a new normal or go back to the previous way. Will it be efficient enough? Probably not. I think the pandemic showed us that we can be more efficient, but at the same time, there has to be a balance because efficiency does not always equal quality,
Yes.
and we never want to compromise quality.
Right.
So I think once again, even a year later, we have to conclude the interview with, we're just gonna have to wait and see.
That's right.
Because we don't know what the future holds.
Right, but it's a great point that you make that efficiency does not necessarily equal justice. And that was the point of the founding fathers when they created the political system that we have. It's not supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be a little bit messy. And right now, I think what we're trying to see is how much of that messiness is still necessary to have justice, and how much of the efficiency that they're looking for is really valid and workable. And that's what the tension's about.
Yes, and I feel like discussing efficiency versus justice and just knowing that those two are just not the same, I feel like that creates more messiness. So we're not going to get into it.
Yes. Well, they're not mutually exclusive. And,
no, not at all. But they're not the same thing.
And sometimes efficiency creates justice. So that's, and sometimes it doesn't. But I think that it's one of the issues that we're dealing with is how do we take this technology and make it better than the system we had before? And that's the ultimate goal.
Right. Yeah, well, Tim, I don't have any more questions. Is there anything that you would like to add?
No, I'm good. I think we've had a nice conversation, and I really do appreciate being here.
Well, I really appreciate it too. I think that the Historical Society is conducting an amazing project because we get to not only experience all this change and go through adaptation to all these changes, but we also get to record the response to these changes. So I feel like this project is amazing, and we will get a chance to look back and see, hey, this was me experiencing things, and it's a lot different than just reading about something from the past.
Right.
So I think in a way, and I'm not trying to minimize the harm caused by the pandemic, but I feel like in a way we are almost privileged to be living during this change. So I just reflecting back on that, I think this is an amazing project. So we are lucky to have you
Thank you.
here and participate. But I do hope that we will get a chance to speak in the future, and I can't wait to see what we're going to be discussing. So you take care, okay?
Thank
and
you. You
I
too.
wish you good luck moving forward.
You as well.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ellen.